It is our privilege and joy to have Nick Toosey speak to us today at this very special Eucharist. I first met the Toosey family in Oxton, Birkenhead, where I knew Patrick. And I knew then, of course, of the Toosey family's association through their father with the Far East Prisoners of War Association. And imagine my joy, of course, when I discovered here there was another Toosey. And I thought, well, the two must be connected, and they are, of course. And so it's Nick Toosey today who is going to speak as part of this service from his remembrances and also for his father, who many will know, of course, through Bridge over the River Kwai and other works, and a wonderful, wonderful leader in every respect, who is greatly honoured. So Nick and all the family, or some of the family, I can just see you behind, and you go even further back still. Hello. It's just wonderful to have you all with us today as you support Dad and Grandad as he's going to speak very shortly. We heard from Henry just before the service began some of those well-known songs of the 1940s. We're going to stand now as Stuart plays to us as we listen or we hum, O God, our help in ages past.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. Ian, our rector, has very kindly asked me to give you a few minutes' talk on this, the 75th anniversary of the end of the war with Japan. Although, of course, it was actually yesterday was the anniversary. I will relate to you briefly some of my, perhaps inaccurate, memories of my father, who, as he used to say somewhat sardonically, served as a guest of the Japanese government from 1942 to 1945, and later helped to set up the Far East Prisoners of War Association, which is still flourishing today. Maybe I am the only person here in this church who remembers meeting his father for the first time. As a young boy of 5, I was taken by my mother and other family members to the Pier Head in Liverpool to await the arrival of SS Orbita. This was a ship bringing a large number of British prisoners of war back from the Far East, after being held for nearly 4 years by the Japanese and Koreans in the most appalling conditions and circumstances. By an amazing coincidence, this was the same ship on which my father had been brought back from Rio de Janeiro at the end of his contract with a firm of Liverpool cotton merchants 17 years previously and in happier days. The ship was crowded with soldiers in uniform, all waving and cheering, and I remember my mother saying, "There he is, there he is." But of course, I did not know for whom I was looking, as he had been out of my life since my birth, serving in France, Dunkirk, and Thailand. My mother told me that my father had to have a medical before he could be brought home, so off we went home to await him. Time went on, and eventually I was put to bed. But at what seemed to be in the middle of the night, I was woken up and very grumpily brought downstairs to meet this strange man, who was apparently my father. My childish memory was of a very thin, serious man, seated in an armchair. Conversation, as you can imagine, was difficult and short, and with a sigh of relief and possibly a huge yawn, I was returned to my bed. My niece Julie Summers, whom some of you know, has written a book called Stranger in the House on the dramatic effects on family relationships and the lives of those who had been in prison for long periods during the Second World War. Our family was no exception. My father was apparently a changed man who talked very little about the horrors he had experienced and witnessed, but was clearly very affected by them. For the first few months after coming home, he slept on the floor in his own room, as he had done for the previous 4 years in prison. He also suffered from very serious nightmares, which in the early years were usually accompanied by loud screams and shouts. I was too young to hear any of these, but my brother and sister certainly did. The other person who was seriously affected by the change was my mother. For 4 years, she had single-handedly managed the household of 3 young children, organised the growing of vegetables on the tennis court, wheeling and dealing with the grocer in Williston for extra tin food, and negotiating for black market petrol with the splendid one-eyed Mr. Evans, the local garage owner. He would ring up every now and again and say quietly, "Mrs. Toosey, your bicycle is repaired," which meant that black market fuel was available for special customers. For funds, she relied on the monthly visit from one of the clerks from my father's employer, Baring Brothers, who continued to pay him something throughout his captivity. She also worked in a local canteen in Little Sutton, serving tea and coffee to the troops, and in addition corresponded regularly with many of the wives and families of the various regiments from whom the prisoners were drawn: the Hertfordshire Yeomanry, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and the Gordon Highlanders. Probably, like many other war widows, she was one of the unsung heroes of the war, but she was now no longer in full charge, and sadly, this resulted in a strained and difficult relationship with my father, with neither ever able to communicate their wartime experiences to the other. My father was very much involved in helping to set up the Far East Prisoners of War Association, with branches throughout England and Scotland, who held regular reunions and who raised funds to support prisoners with health and financial difficulties, in addition to the funds raised from reparation monies obtained with very considerable difficulty from the Japanese and British governments. During my years at Cambridge, one of the college porters had been a FIPO, Far East Prisoner of War, and he invited me to several of their local reunions, where I began fully to learn the extent of the affection in which my father was held. It was, however, noticeable that very few of the officer prisoners got involved in these reunions, a fact which always disappointed my father. After university, I moved back up to Liverpool, where again I used to sometimes deputise for my father at FIPO reunions in and around the city, which were always very well attended, often by people from other areas. Perhaps one of the most daunting moments of my life was when my father was unwell and unable to make the annual FIPO reunion at the Festival Hall in London. So he asked me to deputise for him and deliver his keynote speech, written in his dreadful handwriting. But he also said, "It is not really complete, so you can add a bit more if you wish." A daunting prospect indeed. I don't think I have ever been so nervous in my life as Jane and I travelled down to London for the occasion. We were being picked up at 3 p.m. from our hotel, so whilst I was having a shower before leaving to go, Jane suddenly appeared with a very large brandy, which somewhat steadied my nerves, and I trust did not make me slur my speech in the company of distinguished generals and many other high-ranking guests. I shall end my memories with the story of a Japanese major, Teruo Saito, who was initially second in command of a camp called Tamarkan, where my father was based. He had been a regular officer with the Imperial Japanese Army, and nobody seemed to quite understand why he was in such a lowly position as camp guard. However, he seemed to have forged some understanding with my father as to how to resolve mutual problems that arose in the camp. After the Japanese surrender, my father and his colleague, Captain David Boyle, who spoke fluent Japanese, were asked to write a report on a list of Japanese guards with a view to the authorities recommending the form of their punishment for war crimes. Saito was on that list, but my father and David Boyle argued vigorously that although a tough disciplinarian, he was neither vicious nor vindictive, as many others were. Their version was accepted, and it saved Saito's life. Saito knew this and was very grateful to my father. After the war, he became a successful businessman in Japan, and every year sent Christmas cards and presents to our family. He came to England on a tour shortly before my father's last illness and wanted to see him again. My father said he was not well enough to see him, but he would talk to him on the telephone if I could arrange it, which I did. Saito thanked my father in English for saving his life, and then became extremely emotional in Japanese. So my father asked me to end the call, saying he could take no more. That night, sadly, his nightmares came back seriously. Saito visited UK again after my father had died, and my brother Patrick took him to see his grave in Landican Cemetery. He asked my brother to leave him whilst he wanted to be on his own with his thoughts at the graveside. When he rejoined my brother, he said, "You may not know this, but after my experience with your father in war and his treatment of me, I converted to Christianity." Thank you for your attention and forbearance, and to him, thanks again for giving me the opportunity of reliving these memories, which I hope will never die.